You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. In the next half hour, we'll see what's making the headlines with the Financial Times Whitehall Editor, Sebastian Payne, and the Spectator's economics correspondent, Kate Andrews. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. The granddad of 6-year-old Arthur Labinjo Hughes is on the front of the Sun, saying his grandson's killers must never be freed. The Telegraph reports that nearly 2/3 of housebound people have yet to receive their COVID booster after many GPs opted out of delivering top-up jabs. A vaccine creator is warning the coronavirus pandemic is far from over and the next one that follows could be even more lethal. That's the front of The Guardian. The Mirror says fears are growing that Christmas celebrations could trigger a surge in coronavirus cases and lead to restrictions in the new year. The Financial Times leads with the chief executive of Lloyds Banking Group preparing a strategy that would include expanding its ambitions in property. Snow, wind and heavy rain is coming to batter Britain. Storm Barra is set to bring more power and travel chaos before Christmas, says the Metro. The Express says certain EU rules are set to be axed, which will give smaller UK companies a better chance of winning multi-million-pound contracts. And the Mail has a royal story on its front, claiming Prince Harry raised concerns about the donor in the Cash for Access scandal. Joining me tonight, Sebastian Payne and Kate Andrews. Welcome to you both. Good evening. Let's start with the Mirror and a suggestion here, if you look at the headline, that Christmas could be our undoing, according to an expert. Kate.
So in a few weeks' time, the Prime Minister is set to lay out what Christmas Day will look like. Of course, we're now in the Christmas season, and it seems very different to how it was last year. The UK, on most accounts, is more or less free to go about its business. People can more or less do what they want with, some very key mask mandates and also some new quarantine mandates around the new variant. The suggestion here, though, is that a free Christmas might lead to more restrictions, perhaps even a lockdown in January. Now that we know for political reasons that the government really wants Christmas to go ahead as normal. But I think what's being overlooked here are the politics and also the numbers when it comes to COVID right now. We know this virus can always surprise us. But from a political angle, I think even return restrictions and certainly lockdown in January would be very difficult for this government. It's not at all obvious that Boris Johnson's own backbench MPs would necessarily go along with it. Also, when we look at the numbers, again, we know things could change, but right now, COVID patients occupy roughly 5% of hospital beds. We're 83% below the peak of where we were when things were at their worst in the health service. This does raise questions, really, as to what's going wrong here. Of course, everybody should be encouraged to get their jabs. We want as few people in hospital as possible, but arguably there is capacity in the health service. So why we're all of a sudden saying there are going to be restrictions in January if things aren't tamed now, I do think should be challenged slightly.
And Sebastian, do you think we might see restrictions brought in re-Christmas? I mean, we're very close to it now, but to prevent the ultimate, which could possibly be a lockdown in January?
Look, I don't think we're anywhere near that. And we've got to be very aware we're in such a different place from where we were before with coronavirus because of the vaccines. This time last year, the AZ jab was on the cusp of being approved. It was still months before we got the first shot into people's arms. So I think it's very clear that the reason we had lockdown was because there was no way of controlling infections. Whereas we do have that now. We also have many better medications, antiviral pills and the like, with more coming online every week that help us combat that. So I think we've got to be careful about not getting carried away here about lockdown. And of course, there's a heavy economic and health cost that comes with lockdown as well, in terms of the wider economy. So I think the question is, we just look at Christmas. It's going to depend what we find out about the Omicron variant. And we read in the weekend papers that around the 17th of December, Boris Johnson will have a pretty clear view from the Porton Down laboratories what this new variant is. And there's two key things to look out for. One, is it more more transmissible? And two, does it cause more serious illness? Now, all the data we have so far is very patchy and incomplete. There are some signs it may be more transmissible, but there is nothing in terms of serious illness. So I think until you get that, you can't really speculate about what measures may or may not be needed. But I think fundamentally Kate is right. There's no appetite in the Conservative Party or in the government to go back into further measures, which come with a big economic cost and a health cost to the wider economy. And second of all, I think Boris Johnson very much wants people to have a good Christmas. You know, if you look at what happened last year, and people feel a big sense of deja vu when we had the Alpha variant that emerged and disrupted all of our plans. But I imagine Christmas will go ahead pretty much as we would expect it to normally. There may be, for example, more stringent mask wearing rules. There may be an order to. But aside from that, I don't really think this side of Christmas things are going to change that significantly.
Let's go back to last Christmas. Still being discussed in the context of a bash, a Christmas bash that was held allegedly, and also a leaving do Boris Johnson is supposed to have held. What is Dominic Raab saying about possible investigations into this, Kate? This is the Metro.
Well, he dismissed it this morning, saying that there was no probable cause to go back a year and look into whether or not the Prime Minister and potentially other people at the heart of government were breaking lockdown rules. Now, I'm always skeptical when we actively tried to bring the police into allegations against anybody breaking lockdown rules, because so often when people have been accused of it, the police get it wrong. But there is a much broader question that I think the Prime Minister has to answer here, and it's an accountability issue. When you are the person who is making the rules, you must not be the person who is also breaking the rules. Now, Downing Street is insistent that the Prime Minister and whoever else was potentially attending an event that they haven't actually said didn't take place. They've said that at any time the rules were being followed. But we know throughout the summer, also through revelations about who was in Downing Street on Christmas Day last year, that the people making the rules could often find loopholes, or they were able to get around it more easily, whether this was ministers traveling abroad for work that was clearly not urgent and not having to quarantine upon return because the rules were written in the government's favor, whether it was special events when we were coming out of COVID that just happened to line up with the Westminster's best events and the hottest items in the Westminster calendar that ministers were attending. We know that they have loopholes, and it's not in the spirit of what the public was asked to do last year and for a huge chunk of this year. It's not in the spirit of staying home and keeping safe. The fact that the story continues to rumble on suggests to me that while we may never really get answers, people will continue to ask questions of the Prime Minister and his team, because it doesn't sit right that even if it was technically legal, people would be having drinks and enjoying themselves in a way that the public was expressly told not to.
Yes, and on that note, the Metro quotes campaigners from COVID-19 bereaved families for justice who said that they're sickened by the prospect of the government hosting parties while thousands were dying and millions of families were separated at Christmas. Sebastian.
Indeed, and you can understand the anger about this if we recall the Barnard Castle incident where Dominic Cummings, who was then Boris Johnson's chief advisor, broke COVID rules by driving across the country. That created huge outrage because it gave that sense it's one rule for them and one rule for the rest of us. And that's a very similar thing with this particular story here. And so far, all number 10 has said is it doesn't recognise the account. It says rules were followed at all time, but it won't engage in any of the details about this. And, you know, the Met have said they're not going to investigate this today. They haven't actually done that much investigating a retrospective breaking of the COVID regulations here. But, you know, I think there is one clear thing that I saw in my day job as a political journalist is that people in Westminster had a very different COVID experience to a lot of the country, because many of them were continuing to go into the office because they had to for work, for policy reasons, although there was obviously a lot of working from home like the rest of the country. But it was certainly a bubble compared to how, say, the City of London or other cities or manual sectors were working throughout the pandemic. And that in itself had a stunting effect on policy making. And I think some critics might say that the government was more eager to go into lockdown because it didn't necessarily have the same effect on very senior parts of the government or senior elements of the civil service. And I think when we look at this number 10 party, that might speak to that particular kind of thing there. But, you know, ultimately, is this going to be damaging for the government? I think it does play into that narrative that Labour has tried to put across by saying, you know, they say one thing, do another. They're not on your side, and particularly particularly for those parts of the country that voted Tory for the first time in 2019. Boris Johnson tried to paint himself as a different kind of Conservative leader, a bit more populist, shall we say, someone who's on the side of the people and has often used the term the people's government. When they see stories like this, it's same old politicians, same old Tories. I think that's why the government is just not engaging in this and hoping the story will shut up and go away. But it's actually now crime week for Boris Johnson. There's a whole wave of announcements coming over the next couple of days. And I imagine a lot of people will be saying, well, hang on a minute, you're talking about getting tough on the causes of crime. What about potential breaking the COVID rules in your very own building?
Kate, let's move on to the Telegraph and the government eager to get people to take up their booster jabs, but there are 300,000 housebound people who seemingly have been neglected.
Yeah, this is a startling number on the front page of the Telegraph tomorrow. It suggests that roughly only a fourth of people who are housebound, who need their booster in order to keep them as safe as possible as COVID continues to be a part of our lives, have actually been able to receive their booster jab. And the Telegraph is saying that a lot of this comes down to the fact that GPs have opted out of the home delivery service to deliver boosters. And then, of course, there's the knock-on effect that many GPs aren't wanting to be back in the office either, which just really limits the number of people who can quite crudely get jabs into arms through the GP service. Now, we saw that the national rollout of the vaccine at the start of the year was hugely successful, in part because you almost had that military style of mass vaccination centers just shuffling people through to get their jabs. But if we are going to learn to live with the virus, and it's going to become like getting your flu jab as well as your COVID booster, then there's going to be a crucial role for GPs in that. It has to be a more sustainable system, which clearly we don't have yet. There's going to be a blame game. Is this the government's fault? Is this an issue of resources? Is this the GP's fault, the NHS's fault, that there aren't enough people to deliver these jabs? But the bottom line here is that there are an estimated 300,000 vulnerable people who are homebound, who haven't had their booster yet. And as Seb suggested at the beginning of this segment, the vaccines are the huge game changer that we have now. They are the solution to the COVID crisis, and we just have to be delivering those booster jabs to the people who need it.
Sebastian, we're running out of time, but quickly come in on this.
Yes, and I think, look, the fact is there's still about a good 10% of the country that hasn't had its first or second jabs of COVID vaccines, and that is going to become so crucial to try and make sure we can get through the winter without a big problem for the NHS, and trying to track down that final 10% and persuade them, I think, is really important, as well, of course, as that booster programme.
Sebastian and Kate, thank you very much for the moment. Coming up, plans to seize the passports of middle-class drug users. That's on the front of The Guardian. Welcome back. You're watching the press preview. Still with me, the Financial Times' Whitehall Editor, Sebastian Payne, and the Spectator's economics correspondent, Kate Andrews. Let's have a look at the Sun, and the headline speaks for itself. There can't be a person around who doesn't know what this is in reference to. The very distressing story, the murder of Arthur Binjo Hughes. Kate.
Yes, I think now that we've had, the tragic updates about what happened to this poor little boy, people are obviously asking how this could have happened. And Arthur's grandfather is calling for an inquiry, and the government is planning on an inquiry, which is going to include looking at a sentence review for how long Arthur's murderers in particular will be behind bars, but how long anybody should be behind bars. I think part of this comprehensive review, we have to look at sentencing, but we also have to look at how the authorities got this so badly wrong, given the evidence we have now that they were alerted to the dangers and the abuse taking place in that home, and how this was allowed to continue. And also the safeguarding that we have for children that exists outside of the home. Obviously, with lockdown, any attention that Arthur might have had from other grown-ups was extremely limited, and that makes the situation even more difficult. But it has to be holistic, because we have to do everything we possibly can to make sure a tragic incident like this is never repeated.
Yes, and Sebastian, we know, as Kate is saying there, that the government are launching a review. But we have been here before with cases such as Victoria Colombier, Baby P, and we've had reviews before. What is going to be different this time?
Well, I think obviously this is coming from the very top. This is the Prime Minister has called for this, and Suella Braverman, the Attorney General, as well. So in terms of this whole case, but also the particular sentencing, I think, everyone has just been shocked by just the sheer depravity of what you've seen of how Arthur was treated. And of course, as you mentioned, there's many instances, the baby P one comes to mind a lot as well, about how this was not seen via the various levels of authority. And I think, as we found in that instance, there was a systemic problem in terms of child protection and services available. Now, there's been a lot of questions here about whether lockdown played a role in this, because obviously people were home a lot more, and did that encourage, and I'm sure that's going to be part of the review. But I think, as has been noted, how did teachers of Arthur not notice that, he was being mistreated, he wasn't being fed properly, he was being treated so badly at home here? So I think that's the questions you have to look into, that at school and in the community, there should have been people who were spotted this. Why did they? And if they did they report it? And did they have the mechanisms to do something about it? Because that's how I have to make sure this thing doesn't happen again. And I think with the sentencing as well, I think his stepmother's got is the 29 years with before potential parole. But I think people will want to see something much stronger, because it is totally sickening, and it reads the gut of your stomach when you read the reports here. And it's beyond comprehension how humans could behave like this. But we also have to make sure the system is in place to cope with even people who give the most disgusting treatment.
Yes. Kate, take us to The Guardian, this story about how to deal with wealthier drug users, suggestions from Boris Johnson as to sanctions they may face in future.
So, as part of the government's crime week, in which they want to show that this Conservative government will crack down on crime, will go hard on crime, it looks like their first big announcement, or one of their first big announcements, will be around middle-class drug users. And they're trying to suggest here that you won't just be facing fines if you are using drugs and purchasing Class A drugs. You could be facing far more serious consequences, including losing your driver's license and losing your passport. I mean, look, when I read a story like this, I'm skeptical as to how this might actually hold up if a person were to challenge this in the court of law, whether or not such an authoritarian measure as taking somebody's passport away really would hold up. To me, this crackdown only suggests that the entire system as it relates to drugs in this country is just still completely wrong. There's so much exploitation that comes from the current system. But unfortunately, this crackdown is unlikely to end it, to actually cut out those who are exploited, whether they're in the UK or they're in a developing country. Usually comes through the legalizing process, and it's not being considered here.